Is the Democratic narrative surrounding January 6th crumbling? Because after the release of never-before-seen video footage from that fateful day, right-wing political commentator Dinesh D'Souza seems to think so.
Here is Scott Adams commenting on what he's seeing. The entire architecture of deceit is crumbling. Feel it. What he's saying is that a narrative, in order to succeed, has got to have a limited amount of facts. And when facts start coming out one after the other, facts that are indisputable, that you can see with your own eyes, that contradict the narrative begins to become shaky. And this is, by the way, I'm going to call it to some degree the 2000 Mules effect, because that's the effect that 2000 Mules had on the, quote, safest and most secure election in history narrative. Now we come to the January 6th narrative, and my question is it really crumbling? Let's look at some of the scenes that we are seeing that are out there now on social media. One of them shows a guy who is evidently in handcuffs or restraints. And he comes up to the cops, and they take the restraints off, and then they kind of fist bump him, and they let him go. So the first question is, who is that guy? Is he, first of all, is he a normal Trump guy? Let's just say that he's a Trumpster. He comes in. Evidently, someone's put handcuffs on him. He goes up to the cops, and they're like, well, there are all these other guys around here. They're not handcuffed, so why should you be? And so it's like, listen, you're not a bad guy, or we'll take off your handcuffs, and you seem peaceful enough. You don't seem you need to be restrained. And this guy then joins the crowd. So if that's the case, what kind of insurrection are we dealing with?
Well, in case you missed it, last week, House Republicans, led by Speaker Mike Johnson, made over 40,000 hours of previously secret January 6 footage available online for public access.
According to former President Donald Trump, that video is exonerating. He reposted a warning to those who blame him for the January 6th riot. It read, quote, everything you've been told about January 6th is BS. The real insurrectionists are those who framed Trump to try to stop him from ever being president again, and who framed you as domestic terrorists to try to crush America first. They have failed, and they will pay.
So we talked about the new footage the other day. Look, I'm not one who's trying to totally recast the events of January 6th. I think a lot of bad behavior did go on, which was rightly prosecuted, including trespassing and breaking of windows and defacing of public property, and people who fought with the police. I have no tolerance for that. I do think, now we've seen, though, a lot of footage. So this new footage shows people calmly walking through the halls. The police are letting them do so. This might be after the protesters had already smashed through, and then other people came through. And I wish we could just like watch all the footage and have it made all publicly available. So now you have to go to the Capitol to view it on like a private telescreen or something. I don't know why we're doing it that way. But they did, they charged some people who weren't even there, the Proud Boys leadership, with organizing a terrorist attack on par with like 9/11. They got like 20 years. And so when you see footage of a lot of protesters, not all of them, not saying it's all of them, calmly walking through the halls, escorted by the police or around the police in a way that is not, they're not getting any pushback, they're not being told not to do that, I think it does very much complicate their narrative that we watched a highly organized extremist attack on our Capitol with an actual goal of halting the election, and that it was part of this extremist movement, that it had leadership and it was organized, and there's no more to question or see there. That just, I think, has collapsed.
I don't think it's collapsed. And I would argue that, of course, everyone who was there on January 6th wasn't the people who were climbing on things, taking down flags and piercing at officers and clowning. There were people there who were just holding signs, who were just there. I don't think that narrative, I don't think that narrative was one that was ever really lost. They focused on those who were abusive, because those who were abusive and clowned were, quite frankly, criminals who were trying to effectively overturn an election. But exoneration here is a very interesting term. We know that Trump used that himself multiple times. It was technically incorrect. And this is not a case where that video footage could be considered an exoneration. Again, there were thousands of people who were out on January 6th who were in front of the Capitol. All of those thousands of people weren't ambushing and, committing acts of violence. The ones who were, however, the ones who were, storming people's offices, the ones who were, bashing police officers' heads in, those people were the subject of the investigations. Now, the Proud Boys is a different conversation because the Proud Boys did organize. They had several organizing tactics that they did via social media, which were publicly available. We could all see them. In addition to that, there were entities that funded getting several individuals here. Again, not saying that all of the individuals who were funded by conservative organizations were there for violent activity. But that does not exonerate any of these people. I think that there is a concerted effort amongst the right to try to recast January 6th as basically a tourist attraction to a certain extent, and that's problematic. But the American people recognize, one, that election was not stolen. Two, that former President Trump ran around the country saying things that were untrue, and so did many of his acolytes. Also, that January 6th was a very destructive time for the American public. Now, are people looking towards today further prosecutions and further conversation and media coverage of January 6th? I would argue no. I think the majority of America, regardless of what side of the aisle they happen to be on, voter electorate-wise, have since moved on. They don't want to see America go down that path again, because the fear is that if people aren't held accountable for January 6th, that we will be very close to having that type of situation happen over again. And that's a very scary place to be. And I think that we should acknowledge that, and that this very small snippet of the day does not eradicate the fact that there were several people whose lives were legitimately at risk.
There was, so no disagreement on the election. The election was not stolen. Dinesh D'Souza, whose clip we played, has put out that documentary that he referenced, asserting otherwise. I think it's totally inaccurate, incorrect. Donald Trump was foolish to say the things that he said about the election, both because they were wrong and they served to make it less likely that he would ever be just elected again. It doesn't even make sense from his perspective, because it's very clear that moderate voters and swing voters and independent voters in the states he needs to win don't like when he keeps talking about it, and even though he can't shut up about it. So I don't have any disagreement with you on any of that, and I'm glad you recognize that a lot of the activity that went on there was, in fact, First Amendment protected activity. You don't have to agree with what people are protesting about to recognize their right to do so. I do think the mainstream media and many in the Democratic Party have tried to, so we're trying to recast January 6th a little bit because it has been held up as equivalent to a terrorist attack. I think it was an embarrassing day. I think it was an embarrassing spectacle. I was there covering it. What I witnessed was not good. Smashing the windows of the Capitol, trespassing, fighting with police. These are all things, conservatives always said that only the left would do, only like Black Lives Matter protesters and Antifa or something. And then they did it, and they really ceded a lot of the moral high ground there, and I think that was a big mistake. But I can't co-sign the idea that the people going to jail for 10 and 20 years or more fits the gravity of what occurred there. I don't think it was organized. I think it was the protest was organized. I think the idea to storm the Capitol was a spontaneous riot action taken because the crowd was hyped up based on what Trump had said. I don't think they had any actual plan to halt the. I mean, they had a plan to halt it. Not a plan. They succeeded in halting the vote counting, but then the vote counting was just going to happen at another time. They didn't on January 6th. It was
just because they were ignorant in their ploy doesn't mean that there wasn't one. Well, just because their tactics were not successful doesn't mean that they did not go there with an ideology to create chaos and mayhem to thwart.
I think it knocks down the idea that this was an organized and seditious plot.
It wasn't organized well. A disorganized plot does not mean that it wasn't organized. It means that their organizing processes they failed. They weren't as smart and strategic as they assumedly thought that they were. But this isn't the first time in American history where we've seen vigilantism go awry.
Yeah. But a lot of time we see that, and also there's the question about, well, who was goading them to go into the building? The Capitol Hill chief of police was, set to talk about how there were, in fact, some, not a conspiracy theory, that there were police operatives among the crowd, which is common for extremist groups. Often there are police embedded within them. Militia groups, white supremacist groups are often, their activities are often closely monitored by law enforcement. In fact, half the people in the group are often usually law enforcement or law enforcement informants.
You don't have to sell me on law enforcement being shady.
Right, you know that. So, I mean, I have questions about the extent to which that was happening too, because there's one guy the day before who says, and we're going to have to go into the Capitol, and everyone goes, nope, Fed, you're a Fed. If you're telling us to do crimes, you're a Fed, because these very right-wing people know, some of them are idiots, but some of them know from their previous experience with militia groups that the person inducing you to commit a crime is very often a member of law enforcement, because that's how they entrap you. That's how they can then charge you. So I still have a lot of questions about that.
Well, we also talk about the mapping out and the targeting of specific offices at the Capitol. If you're someone who does not work there often or somebody who doesn't visit often, I've lobbied there. It's still frustrating to get around to some people's offices. The direction in which individuals who had never been to D.C. before largely, or definitely had not, navigated Capitol Hill, to be able to know, hey, this is the door you go into. These are the spaces you walk. There are a lot of conversations around what level of intelligence they had before they got here, because they weren't just wandering around the Capitol. Like, that's a narrative that is false.
Well, right. I mean, they will say, or some on the right have alleged, in some places they were almost being like escorted by the police or by people who were in the building, which made some of them think that they were welcome to be there. Now, again, that's not a plausible defense for the people who broke open the windows and barged in. And again, I'm good to charge people commensurate with what they actually did on that day. I'm skeptical of the broader organized terrorist extremism charge that did end in some really long sentences for a couple people.
Especially for Tario, who used to be a government informant.
Right. Indeed. Yes. In fact, that is the case. So, well, we will continue to see how the coverage of the new footage shapes out, and we'll have more Rising right after this.